Hello and welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. AFP video journalist Armen Soldin killed in eastern Ukraine. United Nations announces resumption of outbound inspections under Black Sea grain deal. Plus, China says it's in touch with countries seeking a ceasefire in response to an EU proposal to blacklist Chinese companies. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Armen Soldin, a 32-year-old video journalist for the French agency AFP in France, has been killed by rocket fire near Chasiv Yar in eastern Ukraine. That's according to AFP colleagues who witnessed the incident. Now, the attack happened in the town's outskirts close to Bakhmut, the epicenter of the fighting in eastern Ukraine for several months. AFP said on Twitter, Soldin was with 4 colleagues who are all unhurt. They were with Ukrainian soldiers during the attack. The post further reads, "All of our thoughts go out to his family and loved ones." The United Nations said inspections resumed yesterday of outbound vessels under a deal allowing the safe Black Sea export of Ukraine grain. The UN and Turkey brokered the Black Sea export agreement in July to help tackle a global food crisis that has been worsened by Moscow's war in Ukraine. Officials from Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the UN make up a joint coordination center in Istanbul, which implements the deal.
Last night, our colleagues at the Office for the Black Sea Grain Initiative reported that the Joint Coordination Center had conducted no inspections on Sunday and Monday. The JCC has confirmed that inspections have resumed today on outbound vessels. According to information shared by the Ukrainian delegation with the parties of the JCC, there are 62 vessels waiting to move to Ukrainian ports. Out of these, 8 applications have been sent to the JCC for registration. The Office of the UN Coordinator and the delegation of Turkey are working closely with all sides with the aim to facilitate movements and inspections of inbound and outbound vessels within the framework of the initiative and agreed procedures while discussions for the future of the initiative continue. We do expect some high-level meeting to happen this week. You'll recall that on Friday there was an expert-level meeting in Istanbul, and hopefully that will be followed up in the coming days with a senior-level meeting. I think we're doing as much as we can to have this grain deal extended as often as needs to happen. And so he's working assiduously with different leaders on that. As you know, Martin Griffiths and Rebecca Greenspan are also dealing with various parties, and we'll see what can be done.
Meanwhile, the United Nations AIDS chief, Martin Griffiths, is traveling to Turkey as a high-level meeting with Ankara, Russia, Ukraine, and the UN is scheduled on May the 10th and 11th in Istanbul to discuss the Black Sea grain deal. Now, the UN deputy spokesperson, Farhan Haq, told reporters that Griffiths left Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, for Istanbul. Russia wants obstacles to exports of its fertilizer to be removed for it to agree to another extension of the grain deal, which was signed in Istanbul last July amongst the 4 parties. However, the deal is set to expire on May the 18th. In the meantime, Ukraine's agriculture minister says it has alternative ways of transporting grain if the Black Sea grain deal is not extended past May the 18th. The agriculture minister, Mykola Solsky, was quoted by his ministry saying, "We do not envisage any apocalyptic scenario due to a million circumstances. Ukrainian farmers and Ukrainian traders have shown that they can do a lot, and a lot of export routes can be laid." He adds that there are several scenarios that will be involved in the worst-case scenarios, giving no more details. British Foreign Minister James Cleverly says the UK and the US have the strategic endurance to support Ukraine in the war against Russia until its successful conclusion. Mr. Cleverly joined U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken during a news briefing in Washington, D.C., where he says both countries will continue to support Ukraine in spite of the outcome that the forthcoming offensive generates.
From the UK's point of view, we will of course also continue to provide financial and military aid. We intend to give the Ukrainians the tools they need to successfully defend themselves against the invasion. The message that we send now is really important. I think the message that we should send is that when we commit to something, we stick with it. We have the grit, we have the determination, we have the strategic endurance to see it through until its successful conclusion, and anyone watching should learn that lesson. And we need to continue to support them, irrespective of whether this forthcoming offensive generates, huge gains on the battlefield, because until this conflict is resolved and resolved properly, it is not over. This is not a film. There are no certainties when it comes to conflict. The Ukrainians have consistently outperformed expectations, but there can be no guarantees in war.
We're also working hand in hand, as we have been for well more than a year now, to provide support for Ukraine as it defends its people and its territory against Russia's war of aggression. We applaud the UK's pledge to match in 2023 the $2.3 billion in military support that it provided to Ukraine during the first year of the war. We also talked about the urgent need to extend and expand the Black Sea Grain Initiative. In recent days, Russia has once again returned to blocking ships from sailing to Ukraine's ports to pick up the grain, a cynical action that directly results in less food getting to global markets and to human beings in Africa, in the Middle East, and around the world who need that food. While we're grateful for the tireless efforts of Secretary General Guterres and our colleagues in Turkey working to break this impasse, the world shouldn't need to remind Moscow every few weeks to stop using people's hunger as a weapon in their war against Ukraine.
Є новий оборонний пакет від Сполучених Штатів. Загальний обсяг $1,200 мільйонів.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the United States will provide a new defense package worth a total amount of $1.2 billion. The United States announced earlier that a new $1.2 billion military aid package for Ukraine will include air defense systems, ammunition, and funds for training. Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative funds will be used to purchase the weapons, allowing U.S. President Joe Biden's administration to buy weapons from industry rather than pull them from U.S. stock. In the package, Ukraine will receive additional air defense systems, ammunition, as well as the technology to integrate Western air defense launches, missiles, and radars with Ukraine's native defense system, according to the Pentagon. The funds will pay for 155mm howitzer ammunition, counter-drone ammunition, satellite imagery, and various types of training. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte discussed the war in Ukraine with his Brazilian counterpart, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and said there should be no concessions that affect Ukrainian sovereignty. Now, Mr. Lula had been advocating the creation of a group of nations not involved in the war that can broker peace talks to end the conflict, and has even suggested concessions from both sides. The Dutch Prime Minister, on a 3-day visit to Brazil, laid out the European position regarding the need to defend Ukraine from Russian aggression. The Brazilian leader insisted that peace talks were needed to stop the fighting, noting that Brazil voted for the United Nations resolution condemning the Russian invasion.
I'm glad we were able to talk about the war in Ukraine today. We would all like to see the war end as soon as possible, without making concessions that affect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In our meeting, I stressed that the Netherlands will support Ukraine for as long as it is necessary.
Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang says Beijing will communicate with parties seeking a ceasefire, including Germany. Speaking alongside German counterpart Annalena Baerbock during a visit to Berlin, Mr. Qin said, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council and responsible major country, China will neither watch the fire from the other bank nor add fuel to the fire. Commenting on an EU proposal to blacklist several Chinese companies as part of a new package of Russian sanctions, Quinn said Beijing firmly opposes some countries in using their so-called laws to impose long-arm jurisdiction and unilateral sanctions on other countries, including China. Annalena Baerbock, on the other hand, said that negotiations on the new package of sanctions were continuing, but that it was essential to prevent Russian defense companies from gaining access to war-relevant goods. Russian mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin made a cryptic but profanity-laden comment about those in charge of Russia's special military operation, as they called it, on Ukraine, and further, that the risk getting him into more trouble with the Kremlin. In a long audio rant about the purported lack of ammunition for his Wagner fighters in eastern Ukraine, Prigozhin referred to a figure he called a happy grandfather who thought that all was well with the military campaign, something Moscow calls the special military operation. The Wagner chief made the comment in reference to what he said was a continual refusal of the defense ministry to supply his fighters with the number of shells they needed to take full control of the city of Bakhmut. The defense ministry has said it's working to ensure all battlefield units have what they need. The identity of the grandfather figure Prigozhin referred to was unclear but sufficiently ambiguous to invite speculation. Meanwhile, the French Parliament has adopted a resolution calling on the European Union to formally label Russian mercenary forces Wagner a terrorist group. The resolution, which is non-binding and symbolic, passed with unanimous support across the political spectrum. Its author, ruling party MP Benjamin Haddad, has said he hopes it will encourage the 27 members of the EU to put the Wagner Group on the EU's special list of terrorist organizations. The United Kingdom's top diplomat has cautioned that a long-awaited Ukrainian offensive against Russia may not prove decisive as he urges sustained support for Kiev. On a visit to Washington, Foreign Secretary James Cleverly called for ramped-up military aid to help Ukraine win as quickly as possible, but warned against pinning excessive hopes on the upcoming operation. Mr. Cleverly said at the Atlantic Council, in his words, they have demonstrated themselves to be very, very effective defenders of their country. But we need to recognize that there might not be a simple, quick, decisive breakthrough. Now let's talk to Mr. Peter Dickinson shortly, publisher of the Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, editor at the Odessa Review, joining us from Kiev.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's good to have you on the program this morning. Good to see you again. Now, let's begin with the British Foreign Minister's comments, James Cleverly, who says that the strategic endurance to support Ukraine in the war against Russia until its successful conclusion rested a lot on the support from the UK and the US. Is he correct?
Yes, definitely. There's no question that the UK and especially the US have been the dominant, the most significant partners for Ukraine in terms of military support, in terms of military aid, providing Ukraine with vital military aid, with weapons, with ammunition, with weapon systems from air defenses to tanks now, and hopefully in the future jets. Now, the UK and US are not the only countries providing this support. Poland has also been a major partner and continues to be. The countries of the Baltic states and Central Europe have been very supportive. Germany is an increasingly important strategic partner in terms of weapons support. So there are other countries involved. It is a very broad coalition, but certainly the UK and America have played absolutely vital roles in this process.
To the visit of the Dutch Prime Minister to his Brazilian counterpart, Lula da Silva, Lula da Silva raised an important point for those that criticize Brazil's position, or maybe his position, for being too sympathetic or being soft on Russia. He says that he reminded everyone that Brazil voted for the United Nations resolution condemning the Russian invasion. Now he's talking about a broader coalition where those not involved in the supply of these weapons should help to bring concessions from both sides as one of the measures to help to mediate.
Well, Brazil potentially has a big role to play in this process. I think there's a recognition of certainly in Ukraine, and I would assume in Russia, and I think throughout the international community, that it's not helpful in terms of a peace process to have the conflict viewed purely in terms of Russia against the West. There is an interest, all parties who wish to end the war have an interest in engaging other nations, primarily the major nations from the so-called non-aligned world, the BRIC nations. So that would include certainly China, certainly Brazil. Brazil's position has been criticised, as you mentioned, for being seemingly too close to Russia's. The Brazilians are clearly trying to distance themselves from that, but at the same time, they have a challenge because they don't want to be seen as too close to the Western position, certainly the American position, and to an extent to the European position. So I think Brazil is now trying to strengthen its credentials as a potential peace broker, as a player in this peace process, and underline that it is independent. The big question from the Ukrainian side is, how can we have peace until Ukraine is united and sovereign? Ukrainians are very wary of any talk of peace that involves territorial concessions. The government of Vladimir Zelensky, and indeed opinion in Ukraine, according to all of the polls that have been taken since the war began, and especially recently, make it very clear that Ukrainians do not consider the option of ceding land for peace. They reject that outright. They will not allow Russia to take control of any of their country. So any peace talks that begin from this basis of a compromise which would allow Russia to take some land are essentially dead in the water. So I think Ukrainians at least will be looking to see from countries like Brazil a recognition that some compromises are possible, some areas can be compromised on, perhaps Ukraine's status, perhaps Ukraine's alliances, Ukraine's neutrality. These areas could be discussed, but not Ukraine's territorial integrity.
Now, not to tread on thin ice, Mr. Dickinson, but for those who will criticize President Zelensky's position before the war that led into the conflict escalating into this invasion from Russia, being a relatively new democracy, not an ancient one or an older one, would if he hadn't ascended the presidency, would a different leader in Ukraine have been more diplomatic before Russia invaded Ukraine?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it's obviously a theoretical. It's hard to be specific. But what I would say is that when Vladimir Zelensky was elected as president of Ukraine in 2019, he was seen in Russia and certainly in Ukraine as a potential peacemaker. He came from a Russian-speaking background. He came from a Jewish background. He was not associated with the kind of Ukrainian nation-building nationalism which has long been a major issue for the Russians. So he was seen as an ideal candidate in many ways for Russia. However, within a few years, relations continued. Well, there was a clear indication that relations were deteriorating further, and Zelensky himself seems to have come to the conclusion that there was no real grounds for a realistic peace with Russia, that Russia did not want peace. Russia simply was looking to subjugate Ukraine. So I think that the experience of Zelensky tells us that it would not have made a big difference who was the president. It would be hard to think of a more Russia-friendly president or candidate than Zelensky, in fact. But his experience was very much that there's no middle ground with Russia. Russia's position was clear. They wished to see Ukraine as an unofficial part of Russia's sphere of influence, as of Russia's renewed empire, and they were not interested in negotiating a compromise deal with an independent Ukraine. So Zelensky, I believe, very reluctantly began to adopt a more hardline position, and we moved closer and closer to the events of February 2022 and the full-scale invasion. But I really don't see how any Ukrainian president could have avoided a major clash with Russia without having made very significant concessions in terms of Ukraine's sovereignty, in terms of Ukraine's independence, which are, of course, deeply unpalatable to the Ukrainian public. And it's questionable whether any such president could have realistically remained in power.
Thank you so much for that perspective and information. Now, the Chinese foreign minister, I thought that the Chinese intervention had fizzled out after that now famous phone call between Zelensky and the Chinese leader. But now the foreign minister, Qin Yang, says Beijing will be communicating with parties, including Germany, for a ceasefire. Is it fizzling out? Do you think that China's intervention will yield any sort of fruit?
I believe the Chinese intervention or China's attempts to play a role, a peacemaker role, are just beginning, in fact. I think we're really seeing only the first stages of this process. For the first year of the war, China was very much on the sidelines. They adopted in Beijing what could be termed as a pro-Russian position, but at the same time they were quite careful to maintain a degree of distance and to underline that they were not participating in the conflict, that they would not be supporting Russia with weapons, with direct provision of weapons. So the Chinese role in the first year was negligible, was very, very small. But I think as a country that sees itself as a superpower, as a major global power, there was a recognition in Beijing that they could not legitimately just sit on the sidelines. They had to be involved in this process. And so we saw in February the first big step, which was the publication of China's so-called peace proposals, 12-point plan. Now, that was widely rejected. It was actually mocked by many as being unrealistic and not a fully serious proposal, but it was still an important gesture, an important milestone. Since then, of course, we've had the phone call between the Chinese leader and President Zelensky in Kiev. Now we have these recent comments saying that China will continue. I think they will continue. How important a role they will be able to play is still up for debate. I think that China will play a larger role in the coming months, potentially after we've seen developments on the battlefield change the negotiating positions of both countries, and perhaps make it easier for Russia, or maybe clearer for Russia, that they need to move towards some sort of resolution themselves, that they are in fact losing the war. Then China will be able to play a role as a moderating force, perhaps on Russia. It will be very difficult for Russia to negotiate what would essentially be seen as a defeat by the Russian public if they're dealing primarily with America and the West, who are seen in Russia as their enemies. However, if China was involved in a peace process, the optics of such a process would be much more favorable for Moscow, and Russia could perhaps present it to the Russian public. The Kremlin could present this as some sort of a major global international agreement rather than a defeat or a diktat from the West. So I think China has a big role to play in this process. They haven't done so yet. We haven't seen how they can do it yet, but I think they have a role to play, and we will see a lot more of their efforts to do so.
I have so many more questions for you, but time does not permit. But finally, therefore, as you've just spoken, do you think then that China's place as its impending place, or its now seemingly obvious place, so intentions as a peace broker, as a power broker internationally, Do you think it was thrust on China by the events that have happened in the last few years and the United States not seemingly being as influential, some may argue against this, but as it used to be? Or China is legitimately pursuing a place of being at the forefront of a new world order?
Well, I think certainly. China China is an extremely ambitious country. China has a long-term vision of its future in the world. China sees itself as the rising power. This has been a trend for the last few decades. The Chinese have a tendency to view international affairs, to view their place in the world in terms of centuries, never mind in terms of decades, whereas many countries may look at the world in terms of election cycles, in terms of a 4-year cycle, a 5-year cycle. In China, they talk about decades, centuries, epochs. And I think the current period we're in from a Chinese perspective is a time of a rising Chinese influence. We are seeing China become far more economically powerful. China's role in Africa, for example, has grown enormously over the last 20 years, and it's been part of a very systematic, methodical process where they've clearly identified this as their goal. So I think it's only natural that China now is looking to play a much bigger role on the international stage in terms of diplomacy, in terms of peacemaking, in terms of geopolitics. Now, if you wish to play that role in today's world, the place to play that role is Ukraine. That's clear. So, as I mentioned, China was on the sidelines for the first year of the conflict. Now they clearly think we need to become involved. Of course, they may well have been encouraged by America's quite strident position here, where America has essentially ruled itself out as a peacemaker by being very clearly on Ukraine's side. So China has perhaps an opportunity to say to the wider world, look, we see America playing a partisan role here for whatever reason. We wish to play a more neutral role. This is how we see our position in the world, and we want the international community to support us, to ally themselves with us in efforts to broker a peace from a more neutral position. Now, of course, you can question the neutrality of China in terms of their relations with Russia. That's clear. But nevertheless, I think that there are opportunities for China here to significantly increase their global standing by playing a peacemaking role in Ukraine.
And all this as the war has entered its 441st day. Thank you for your insight, Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of the Business Ukraine magazine, Lviv Today, editor of the Odessa Review, who joined us from Kiev.
Thank you.
After the break, Ukraine displeased with other governments' participation in Russia's Victory Day celebration. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to a special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. In the city of Wagner, Russia commemorated the World War II Victory Day with a concert that could be seen across the river in Estonia and the town of Narva. The Narva Museum answered with a huge poster reading "Putin, war criminal." That in turn could be seen all across the border in Russia. The concert in Wagner was organized by the city's authorities, who set up the stage facing Estonia on the banks of the river Narva, which separates the two countries. Victory Day is one of the most important public holidays in Russia, when people commemorate huge sacrifices made by the Soviet Union during what is called the Great Patriotic War of 1941 to 1945, in which around 27 million citizens perished.
We are looking at people who are gathering, because the public gatherings are forbidden. And if people are gathering, we look if they are using symbols that Russia uses in the war with the Ukraine, because they are also prohibited in Estonia. Such as St. George ribbon, Z symbolize Russian uniform, any kind of phrases or lozungs that say about the supportive things. People support the Russian war. Yes, Russians asked us to take a meeting on the bridge, which we did. We attended, but Estonia is a free country, so we didn't act to this promotion.
Meanwhile, dozens of Euro-maiden Ukrainian activists based in Warsaw, that's in Poland, protested in front of the city's Soviet cemetery and barred entrance to Russia's ambassador, who came to lay a flower wreath to mark the day. The protesters staged an installation at the entrance of the cemetery featuring replicas of shelled buildings and crosses, imitating tombstones with the names of children who died under Russian fire. Russia's ambassador, Sergei Andreev, chose not to walk through the installation and laid flowers on the ground before leaving. Meanwhile, Ukraine has expressed its displeasure with the participation of the Prime Minister of Armenia and the President of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, and Belarus as well, in Tuesday's Victory Day military parade in Moscow. Ukraine's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said in a statement, which partly reads, "We consider participation in the public event alongside a war criminal to be an immoral and unfriendly step towards Ukraine and an expression of contempt for the Ukrainian people." The ministry emphasized that the International Criminal Court in The Hague had issued an international arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin for alleged war crimes. A British-led group of European countries have asked for expressions of interest to supply Ukraine with missiles ranging up to 300 kilometers. The call-out was included in a notice posted last week by the International Fund for Ukraine, a group of countries including the United Kingdom, Norway, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden. UK's Ministry of Defence, which administers the fund, asked companies to get in touch if they could provide missiles that could be launched from land, sea, or air with a payload of between 20 and 490 kilograms. Yurik Sak, an advisor to Ukraine's defense minister, said that Kyiv had no concrete information about the UK-led effort to supply long-range missiles. Now, we are pleased to talk with Professor David Aworawo, professor and head of Department, History and Strategic Studies, University of Lagos. It's good to have you on the program again this morning.
Nice to be here. Thanks you very much.
You're welcome. The Ukrainian comments criticizing Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan and the other countries who are present to show their solidarity with the Russian people on their very important Victory Day parade. Is this seen by you as being an overstretch by Ukraine, given that these countries are also sovereign countries and they have the right to support who they would like to support or to attend the Victory Day parade? And they are given taking into account their historical ties with Russia.
Yes. It is expected that Ukraine will respond the way it did, or it has done, considering developments in the past year or so, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It is expected that Ukraine will respond the way it has done. It is also expected that some of these countries will not want to just erase history like that because there is a war between Russia and Ukraine. So the position of the countries too, that have come to join Russia to celebrate Victory Day is also not surprising. Recall that all of these countries were part of just one country, Soviet Union, up till 25th of December 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. So these countries will have felt that it would not, because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, to want to erase history. So they want to be part of that epoch-making development in their historical life. But of course, Ukraine's position is also understandable, considering what has happened since February last year, when Russia decided to invade the country. So both sides have their logical arguments as far as participation in the Victory Day celebration is concerned.
Is President Putin at that victory parade of the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian position being that derived from a Nazi dispensation? Of course, that has been ridiculed by as many as have more information concerning it. But in trying to whip up national and patriotic sentiments for the people of Russia to get them to stay on his side, for those who are on his side, do you think this was successful? Well, we can't know that, but do you think it was a good thing for him to do at this point? And concerning the claims that the Ukrainian government is being run by pro-Nazi elements, especially criticizing Volodymyr Zelensky, is this just outlandish and totally far-fetched?
Well, it is easy for leaders to talk about brand other leaders, either terrorists or Nazis and all. It is out of place, really. It's expected. In times of war like this, leaders try to use everything at their disposal, rhetoric, propaganda, to try to establish their position and ridicule the other side. But people are aware, very clearly of the fact that there is nothing neo-Nazist about the leadership of Ukraine. Indeed, the events that led up to Victory Day was the invasion of the USSR by Hitler, the Barbarossa campaign that began in June 1941. The USSR was able to rise to the occasion and held its own throughout until the war ended, early May 1945, which is why they are celebrating the Victory Day at this time. So, of course, Zelensky does not belong to that camp, and his activities have not reflected anything. In fact, if anything, Zelensky would belong to the other side, with his Jewish background, and so it's far-fetched. The comments by the Russian leader, Putin, that Nazi and the activities of Zelensky and all that reflects Nazism and neo-Nazis. But one expects that, in times of war, everything that can be brought to the table, that can be put, out there to ridicule the enemy, is deemed to be acceptable. So it is also not surprising that Putin is using those terms to describe Zelensky, even though the whole world knows that what Zelensky stands for is very far off from that description.
Onlookers and watchers and analysts and the schools of thought have opining that the Russian forces are not as strong as they were touted to be. The last time I checked, Russia is a superpower, militarily speaking, but that this offensive by Russia has exposed their weaknesses. In this Victory Day celebration, it was scaled down largely by concerning the number of the soldiers that came out and concerning the display of weapons that they used compared to previous years. Has this conflict diminished Russia militarily in any way?
Yes, it has. It has. I mean, some of the strategies and tactics that Russia has, used to try to, prosecute this war, have revealed that Russia is not as strong as perceived by people until now. Russia is not a superpower. Russia is a great power. Superpowers are the greatest of the great powers. Russia does not. Right now, we only have one superpower, and that's the United States. All the other countries are great powers in their own rights, but they are not superpowers.
What about China?
There's only one superpower, one major power. And China, too, is not a superpower. China is a great power. A superpower is the greatest of the great powers. When USSR was in existence, there were two, United States and the US and the USSR, which was why the world was bipolar. Now the world is unipolar, really, essentially, although many think that it is multipolar. even if we agree that it's multipolar, the other poles are not anywhere near the strength of the United States. So Russia is a great power, but certainly not a superpower. And even, acknowledging that it's a great power, how great Russia is as a great power is not diminished by its involvement in this war. Some of the approaches that Russia has adopted in this war, are anachronistic. If Russia were to face a country like China or United States, Russia will be leveled. All those the trucks, tanks that were lined up hundreds of kilometers away, wars are no longer fought like that. So this war has really diminished, Russia. And like I said several times before now, it's a strategic calculation. The fact that Finland has joined NATO is a clear indication that the war is a strategic miscalculation. And of course, we have figures in the neighborhood of something 150, 200,000 of Russian soldiers already killed. Ukrainian soldiers too, about the same figure. We are talking about 300,000 and more. That is too huge, a number of men to lose in a war at this time. So the war itself has diminished Russia, and we hope that that will be realized very quickly, and efforts will be made to bring the war to an end so that people can move on with their lives.
If Russia is not a superpower, as you say, and their military is vastly diminished, then does Ukraine, in your view, have a chance to win this war outright?
No, certainly not. Ukraine is a medium power, not even a great power. It's a medium power. Ukraine has held on only because of the support it has received from the West. The massive support from the West is what has sustained Ukraine to be able to, hold on for as long as it has. And how much longer Ukraine holds on will also be determined by how much support it receives from the West, United States, Great Britain, and United Kingdom, and some other countries that have given support to Germany and the rest of them. So Ukraine has no capacity to win this war. These other countries will not put boots on the ground to fight with Ukraine. They can only support all of these, weapons and equipment to be able to, hold on, prosecute the war. But Ukraine will not win it. Russia will not win it either. Which is why we are saying that the earlier diplomatic efforts gain momentum to end the war, the better for everybody. Because the way it is now, we are, even though Russia sometimes will gain some upper hand, claim some cities here and there, we are at the stage of stalemate, really. Because Ukraine sometimes will also fight back and then recapture some cities, some parts already captured by Russia. That is where we are, cat and mouse. Which is why we are saying that let diplomacy gain momentum so that this war can be brought to an end. Neither Russia nor Ukraine will be able to win this war, the way things are sketched out.
Trying to help them win the war is the Wagner group, the mercenaries, which leader of the group, Prigozhin, is screaming blue murder on the supply of ammunition to his troops, and he's very vocal about it, and he's criticizing Russia's military brass in this regard. He alleged that Russian troops there's a detail of Russian troops that pulled out of a certain area in Bakhmut, and he was threatening the same thing, but he said that the Russian government said that if he does pull out in any way, shape, form, or fashion, then it's a treasonable act. For a mercenary group, the way they are being depended on, especially in Bakhmut, to secure that victory there, do you think Russia is running too big a risk?
Yes. The way the war has gone on so far, Russia has no choice than to take such risks to see if it could push, as far as possible to get Ukraine to capitulate. But like I said before, Russia will make advancement and probably even, secure Bakhmut and some other cities here and there. But of course, we also see Ukraine fight back. Fight back to recapture some areas that Russia formerly controlled. It's been like that. You capture some, you hold on. They are not really able to hold on for a long time or permanently. And so that gives the other side the ability to regroup, launch a counter-offensive, and then retake some of these areas that Russia formerly controlled. It's been like that, and we do not see the trajectory changing significantly, anytime soon. Which is why we are saying that the earlier they realized their inadequacies to be able to win the war, both sides, the better. Such that, if concerned groups bring peace proposals, they should consider them realistically and seriously, so that that will be the beginning of, efforts to bring the war to an end.
Well, it may be easier to to think that mercenaries will be quicker to desert or commit mutiny than a conventional army. But thank you so much for your thoughts on the issues, Professor David Arroyo. Thank you so much for coming on the program this morning.
Thanks so very much, Olumide.
Now we're going to turn our attention to the business side of things. Our correspondent, business-wise, Laddie Williams, is in the studio with us. Laddie,
good morning.
Good morning. What are the most pertinent issues at this time that will that's either helping or harming the Ukrainian effort?
So basically, at this moment, it's the sanctions, leveled on Russia, and Russia, being able to, circumvent, most of these sanctions. Like today, we got the news that the biggest exchange, that's a crypto exchange in the world right now, does about $6 billion in volume this morning alone. They're being targeted and investigated for allowing, Russians actually trade on their exchange. And we know they did, comply earlier. They put some sanctions and, leveled some accounts, some Russian accounts. They didn't allow those accounts actually trade on their exchange. But fast forward to now, there are indications that some Russian customers are actually able to trade on the exchange right now, and they're able to use, Visa and MasterCard to actually buy, cryptocurrency on, Binance Exchange. So now that's what we've been talking about this whole while, the risk of secondary sanctions, and it's becoming, more apparent that if you're a company and you're aiding Russia in any way, they're going to come for you, and we're already seeing that happening right now. So they're being investigated at this point. That's Binance Exchange, and obviously that's impacted the crypto market. We've seen some sell-offs now because of that news. Bitcoin losing, that 30K level, come down to about 27,000, all, because of that news. Because if they are found guilty, who knows what's going to happen next. But it is secondary sanctions, right now, and Binance is the one facing it.
But is the crypto market that big a deal at this point?
Yeah, it's a huge deal. It's a $1 trillion market, and with the decentralized nature of cryptocurrency, they're able to bypass, most of these, sanctions, because I can send money, $1 million out of Nigeria now to another country with very little fees, about $1 fee. And no one can trace, that transaction. You only know that this money was sent from this wallet into that wallet, but you don't know where it's coming from. So that nature of cryptocurrency, that's why you see, most regulators are quite nervous, about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, because it's decentralized. So there's no central authority that can stop those transactions. So that's why we're seeing Russia, they've been able to use cryptocurrency at this point to evade some of these sanctions.
At the beginning of, speaking of sanctions, speaking of which, at the beginning of this conflict, sanctions upon sanctions upon sanctions, many targeted at individuals and individual companies that were sympathetic to the Russian cause or Russian in other countries. But now the EU is talking about imposing talks on new sanctions against Russia. Can you elaborate on that? And is this also because these sanctions may have essentially failed to deter Russian power?
That's the big debate right now. The sanctions so far, have they been able to, destabilize the Russian cause, the economy and all that? And, with all the data we see coming out of Russia, the data is pointing us in a different direction, making it look like these sanctions are not really working. But at the end of the day, the sanctions do have an impact. There are cracks in the economy, even though we don't get some of those reports. Take, for instance, the grain deal. Obviously, we see Russia there trying to fight for their own interests, that shows that, the sanction is actually working, because they're not able to, even though the sanctions are not on their commodities directly, they're not able to send out, these commodities, exporting it to these countries that actually need it, because there's sanctions on logistics, sanctions on insurance. So all of that, we can see that it is having an effect. If not, Russia would have said, you know what, yeah, let's renew that deal May 18th.
Exactly.
There's no problem. But it shows that the sanctions are impacting them. So these new sanctions, a whole new package now. This one is targeted at, first time, it's going to be targeted at, Chinese companies. So we've seen how China, they've been able to buy, a lot of cheap oil from Russia and still, do some other dealings, with Russia this time. But with this new sanctions they're mulling now, they're going to target companies, because we're seeing the allegations some Chinese companies are selling, some equipment that can be used to make weapons to Russia. So we're seeing the EU not happy with that. So now they're talking about this new package that would impact,
companies
that are directly or indirectly, supporting Russia. So it's a big risk of secondary sanctions.
Thank you, Laddie. More business news after this program on Business Morning, across the board business news.
Exactly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, finally on the program, Vision 2023 contest has kicked off in Liverpool, Northern England, where acts from 37 countries are competing to win the 67th edition of the musical event. Liverpool is hosting on behalf of Ukraine, which won the contest last with the Kalush Orchestra's Stefania. Ukraine was unable to stage the event this year, as a winner usually does because of Russia's invasion. Now, the United Kingdom, which came second, has promised to combine the creativity of Ukraine and the UK under the banner United by Music. Still with the shadow of the 441st day of this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. That's where we leave it on the program this morning. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Please join us again tomorrow. Have a good day.